Welcome to HSBC Global Viewpoint, the podcast series that brings together business leaders and industry experts to explore the latest global insights, trends, and opportunities. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes. Thanks for listening, and now on to today's show.
This is a podcast from HSBC Global Investment Research. Analystifications, disclosures and disclaimers must be viewed on the link attached to your media player.
Welcome to Under the Banyan Tree, where we put Asian markets and economics in context. My name is Herald van der Linde, Head of Asian Equity Strategy here at HSBC.
And I'm Fred Newman, Chief Asia Economist here at HSBC as well in Hong Kong. And we have a live Banyan Tree recording today, a special event, Herald. Who's joining us here live on stage?
Well, sitting next to me is Jing, our esteemed China economist, who obviously is going to talk about what is happening in mainland China. We have Frank Lee, who is our tech analyst and looks at companies such as NVIDIA. So we're going to touch upon the AI bubble. And we have Yuqian, who is the analyst who looks at electric vehicles and companies such as BYD. So EVs, technology, China, that's going to be the topic for this week.
Three key areas to discuss here, three key topics. We're not going to talk about tariffs today. We're not going to talk about what's in the newspaper. We're going to dig deeper right here under the Banyan Tree. So
Exactly.
Let's jump right in.
Good. Jing, you look at the Chinese economy. Some of the data that's coming out is not overly exciting. Things are slowing a little bit here and there. So what makes you excited about China?
I think it's fair to say China is rebounding. I think the most concerning data is the contraction of investment. But there's a reason behind that. For example, we know that the local governments may have some trouble with their own financial situation. So that data may reflect the fact that the local government did not have enough money to go for the capital requirements, so they cannot leverage the other money for investment. That's changing. And on top of that, the government also front-loaded the future quota for the local government debt swap. This point has been underappreciated by a lot, but this is working because we see a lot of companies get paid. They start to normalize their capex and many other things.
So, Jing, let me press you a little bit on this because you say there's actually a lot positive happening as well, yet the economic data is very, very challenging. And I think what people point to in particular is very weak consumer spending. Now, we just had the Golden Week holiday, for example. Per capita spending actually still down compared to 2019. Is there any hope that the consumer will start to come back? Because there's so much riding on the Chinese consumer here. Are you really seeing the consumer coming back, or is it more local government spending, a bit more infrastructure? Yes, we're going to see a bit of a rebound.
For the last couple of years, right?
Which was really
As government
spending
spending
the
and
consumer
subways
is missing here. When is the consumer going to step up?
I think basically consumers are not missing here. But what I'm saying is there's a change of the consumption pattern. There's a change of mentality. For example, now a lot of Chinese, they probably prefer the bang for buck, not necessarily go with the designer brand name, which is more expensive. Another thing which is happening is they prefer a lot on experiencing things. So that has made the service-related consumption probably more promising going forward. And actually, a big focus of the next 5-year plan will put a lot of focus on rebalancing the economy.
But what about investments in technology and these sort of things? That remains a focus, presumably, as well, right?
Yes, indeed. We have seen, for example, in the past 5-year plans, they always set some target in terms of R&D spending and also how to build the ecosystem. And it is really working because in the latest World Intellectual Property Organization's ranking of the most innovative economies, for the first time, China was ranked number 10. And 10 years ago in 2015, China was ranked at 29th. So in just 10-year time, we see China actually advanced from 29th to 10th. And at the same time, when we measure the input-output for innovation, China is getting in much better shape in terms of the efficiency for innovation.
So there is a silver lining, and we want to talk a bit more about technology also with our other two panelists here, because there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in China. But let me ask you again, and I'm sorry to come back to consumption on this, because you have technology investment on the one hand, you get great companies coming through, but unless there is spending at some point, you're not going to essentially generate revenues. Now, for consumers to spend, there is negative and positive news. The negative news is the real estate market is still struggling, but the equity market is doing well. Is the equity market rally, which is driven by hopefulness on technology and optimism about technology, is that going to happen a wider impact on consumer spending on the economy? Is that enough to lift everything up?
I think it has started to have some wealth effect, especially those who have the stock market account. They start to actually get more money and more willing to spend. At least this is feedback I have got from our luxury analyst in his recent tour from China. And on top of that, when we look at consumption, I think in the short term, stimulus matters a lot. In the medium term, it's probably more about structural, like whether we have a big middle income group. And in the longer term, it's all about the income outlook and the wealth accumulation.
Well, this is a bit important, right? Because it's very nice the stock market goes up and therefore the consumer spends more, but that's a sort of cycle that go into reverse as well, because as the stock market will come down, people wouldn't consume as much anymore, and then we're flat on our face.
Herald, stock markets never go down.
Oh, that's
I learned
right.
That
yes,
from
right.
you
They
over
always
the
go
years.
up. I told you that 10 years ago. Is that right? Yes. So, what can they do in order to make sure that it's not just a wealth effect, but income growth and these sort of things are supporting that?
Yes, indeed. So we hear China talk a lot about the new urbanization plan. And actually a core of this plan is to improve the social safety net. So to lift the disposable income. So imagine the migrant workers. They used to need to save a lot just in case they need to go to hospital, they need to send their children to school, who were not eligible to go to public school maybe previously because of their lack of household registration. But now imagine they have equal access to this kind of public services, then they might be willing to spend more. So this is the direction we're seeing.
Another thing that China is doing is what they call, in a convoluted way, the anti-involution policy. What is that and where do we stand with that?
Right. So anti-involution actually refers to this destructive competition. And actually, if I ask my friend who are practicing in competition law, they will tell me this is not even fair competition, because oftentimes we see some of the large players abuse their market dominance by squeezing their suppliers.
So they're selling under cost and stuff like that, squeezing everybody in the market.
Etc. And in China, there's a characteristic which may be absent in other countries, is that local government intervention, like the local protectionism, which has prevented the market to work in a more efficient way.
But Jing, sorry, I need to press you again. And I know we're friends. We sit next to each other. But is it enough to eliminate deflation in China, but purely focusing on essentially eliminating excessive competition? Or is there also excess capacity because we're investing too much? Is it enough what they're doing to eliminate deflation, just focusing on competition policy?
I think these two things are actually related. Because there is overcapacity, we end up seeing the cutthroat competition. To resolve the problem, we need to see the boost on the consumption side and also at the same time normalize the production side.
Now, I was on holiday in Uzbekistan in the last 2 weeks, and what I saw there, the moment I arrived on the way to the hotel, BYD, and Geely as well, and then all sorts of other Chinese cars with brands I'd never heard of, EV cars. So if there's one industry where there's oversupply, that's EVs, right? What is happening in the EV sector? Do we see consolidation? There's this anti-involution, this rationalization. Is that actually taking place?
Yeah, I would say the game of ice and fire. So overseas, of course, on fire because the China EV product, in terms of the product strengths, is leading the globe. So can you imagine in China with about $10,000 you can get a robust EV, and it can also self-driving in the highway and do the auto parking. That's the value and price you are getting. So domestic market, of course, you get over 1,000 car model available on market. So because of the over competition, the pricing environment being challenging, the market is caused for consolidation. So it's a little bit painful. On the overseas market, because the product and the technology and the cost structure is so advanced, China would be able to sell the EV model in overseas with twice the price. So basically, if you go to Europe, you're paying twice as what I'm paying in China.
Yuqian, when we talk about Chinese EV market, it's a phenomenal success, and we all know this. See it even on the roads of Hong Kong. More and more Chinese EVs, fantastic. But there are two elements when it comes to the technology. One is that the cars themselves are really, really good, but it's also the production process, which is very, very advanced. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because it seems to me that it's not just that the technology in the car is good, it's also the way they're being produced. It's just phenomenally competitive. Is that a right observation? How good are they actually at manufacturing this stuff?
Yeah, I would say two things. First is a faster product cycle. Let's say a typical car cycle from a global standard is 5 to 7 years. But in China, if you don't refresh the car every 2 to 3 years, your peers would, and your market share will be taken, which force the model to be refreshed at a much faster speed. So you get to load all these advanced technology, all these fancy fast charging, flash charging into the vehicle. And also, I would say economic scale. China is one of the largest, I would say the largest car market across the globe. It has the supply chain from producing fancy chairs, massaging chairs to
fridges
and
Karaoke too. Oh, look at that.
Yeah, the massive supply chain advantage. So before China EV being leading the globe, China battery is already leading the globe. And battery is 1/3 of the BOM. Therefore, China can reach the cost parity much earlier because the supply chain scale and technology innovation, because we have a big market and iterate faster.
Now, I have a question here. So they are extremely innovative. They got scale, so they bring costs down. That's all nice and well. But this anti-inflation policy means they can't discount that much anymore. That's only helping the smaller companies that struggle to survive, because the bigger ones are not really discounting that much anymore. So it's actually not helping the industry. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, I would say Jing and I was debating about this when we're coming upstairs. So anti-involution initiatives in auto industry means better pricing and capacity discipline. That's good for the near term. It's like a painkiller to the over-competition China auto fever. But the problem about that is we are still yet before the consolidation point. It has to get worse before it get better. So I would say for the temporary chapter, the consolidation is taking a pause, but eventually it will do.
One question on automotive driving. I went to Shenzhen and I took one of these robo-taxis. It's quite amazing. You plug in where you want to go. I actually went with a colleague of mine who did that. And there you go. And it's quite an experience. And suddenly you realize, this car can be completely redesigned. You don't need a steering wheel anymore. And actually you can go further. The whole city can be redesigned. So when is this going to roll out? When are we going to have this in Hong Kong? When is it going to go very fast?
Yeah, I would say now if you travel to Shenzhen, you will get the real commercial paid autonomous driving mobility service. So real.
Actually, I used it for 15 minutes and cost me $8 Hong Kong dollars or 10 Hong Kong dollars. It was equivalent. I mean, it's really cheap.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, it's a real commercial service with no driver sitting on the driver's seat. Currently only available in a geo-fenced area. For example, only in the Nanshan district, you can get that. But eventually, we're at the cusp of the inflection point of the robotaxi. The fleet will grow tenfold next year. So we're looking at a couple of thousand this year, but next year it will be tenfold. But still, don't be afraid. It's only a fraction, only after, even we have explosive growth. It's still a fraction of the current taxi market, which is over 10 million.
But Yuqian, you're an analyst. I need to press you on the forecast here. In Hong Kong, when will all of us here be driving to work in an autonomous vehicle without having to think about driving anymore? Is that going to happen this decade, next decade, 2050, 2060? When is this going to happen?
I would say if it would be easier if you don't specify the geography as in Hong Kong area. So in China, I would say daily commute relying on the car who can drive it itself from your parking lot at your residency to your office will be happening in the coming 6 to 18 months. And for the robotaxi, it's already there. The only problem is about the scaling, and it will be a government controlled, responsible scaling for the coming decade. But for Hong Kong, I would say, yeah, if the government allow, it will be much easier.
Last question. Chinese cars, fantastic, cheap, innovative. Are they going to conquer the world? Is there any space left for German automakers, for American automakers, for Japanese automakers, or are the Chinese going to essentially have a lock on the industry globally?
I would say consumer want a good, cheap, reliable product. That's the ultimate driver. But we're looking at a very complicated global trading environment. Therefore, many of the Chinese OE has localized their production, like being the world's local car, not being a Chinese EV, but being a global EV. So I think trade barrier obviously is one of the near-term challenge, but eventually, hopefully, the good product will find its way.
Good. So we have cars communicating with each other, city planners that can figure out where these cars got to go, communicate with traffic lights and with hospitals, everything. This is AI. So we're getting to the area of AI, and we have Frank here. Frank, you sat on exactly that chair, if I'm not mistaken, 2 years ago, and you talked about the chipset developed by NVIDIA. It was a sort of a gaming thing, cost $200,000. This seems to be the linchpin in that AI story, right? The technology that's been developed by this particular company. How is that progress? Where do we stand with that now?
Sure. I think if you think about the AI story, instead of 2 years ago, we talked about product, how good the chip is, why NVIDIA was such a dominant player. This year has been a very interesting point because you start to see the total addressable market of AI is potentially a lot bigger than I think people expected a couple of years ago. If you think about the first 2 years of AI, it was really about 4 or 5 huge major US hyperscalers spending all this money. Everybody's still questioning about monetization. But since beginning this year, I think what we've seen is a lot more talk about enterprise and sovereign AI. We had the Stargate project got announced in the beginning of the year, and a huge difference from beginning of the year to now, because now we actually have some ideas of when Stargate is going to start to build out. And you start to see, these OpenAI announcements. So now we're looking at a framework where the market potential could be 2-3x of what we originally expected. So I think in some ways, while the product, the chip is important, it's really about how big the market opportunity is now. It looks a lot bigger than people expected just 2 years ago.
So when you talk about market opportunity, you mean the AI hardware that's needed to build the infrastructure. That's ultimately what we're talking about. But in that, there's still just a handful of companies that really are essentially
dominating it. Yeah.
Dominating, right? I mean, that dominance is not declined. I mean, we have a broader application, or people investing in it, but we still have a very small set of companies that are really at the heart of the technology. Or is that a misinterpretation? I mean, NVIDIA must be the poster child here, but who else is really driving this?
Well, I think what you've seen is that, yes, NVIDIA is the center of this. There is a lot more opportunities, especially on the hardware side in the last probably 12, 18 months. You've seen more competitors coming in. You have companies like Broadcom, AMD now who are competing more with it. You also have more component companies on the hardware side. And even in China now, CameraCon has been a big focus this past year because of the ability to make chip for the China market. So I think you are seeing a much more broader-based universe than what we saw probably the first year, which is basically one company.
So NVIDIA is still the industry leader, sets the standard, if you want to put it like that. The story is that actually over the last 12 months that China has caught up very, very well. Where do we stand on that progress? Would you say 12 months ago they would be a year behind and now it's 6 months?
I think if you look at this, it's a different question because China is definitely making progress. But in the grand scheme of investment in AI and the market size, China's not that big, right? And I think if you think about the size of the deals, right, that are being announced right now, the total spend on China is still not a big number. The spend outside of China is much bigger.
Is that because DeepSeek is much cheaper than OpenAI?
I think what it is that you have the scale of these investments in the U.S. is so much bigger, especially now with sovereign. I think what China does is that China is actually more profitable because they think about monetization, I think, much earlier in the stage. I think with the U.S., monetization has not been as critical because the access to capital has enabled these companies to get so big without really thinking about profitability so quickly. So, I mean, you feel like an OpenAI as the best example.
That sounds as a story we've heard before.
I need to pick up on that.
Yes.
Because here's a big question. Yes, you're saying the addressable market is bigger, and suddenly we're talking about hundreds of billions invested, and these numbers keep rising. But there isn't necessarily the profitability yet. There is a question about what the return is. Isn't this a giant bubble at the end?
I knew that question was coming. I think you can definitely say that there are certain things that, to be fair, do make people a little bit more nervous or questionable about a potential bubble, especially the last few months with some of these deals that have been announced. But I think you can also look at it from a different point of view, is that if you look at some of the companies that are at the heart of AI investment, they are generating real money. If you look at NVIDIA, they're making real money. So I think, is there a bubble? Yes. The question is, what stage or inning are we in? Are we in the 7th inning? So, something that's going to crash right away? Or are we still, a few years out in terms of this? Because the one thing that everyone is definitely underestimated is how much demand has increased, right? How much computational demand has increased. Just think of this example, Sora 2 that OpenAI has launched, the video, people playing with that, but the amount of computation that goes into that is exponential. So that's what drives, I think, this continuous investment, is that, the computation you need just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
But is that real demand? Because you're talking about there's a lot of demand for these chipsets, right? It's the service that you need. But it looks to me that companies are very careful in rolling out AI in their own businesses, unsure how that impacts their business and also what the impact of AI is on their business. So it looks like there's caution in demand on the demand side, and there's just a lot of supply coming up.
I think, this year has been interesting, like I said earlier, because it's not just 4 or 5 huge companies, these huge cloud companies that have lots of cash and strong balance sheets that's funding it. Now you're talking about governments getting involved, right? The sovereign market, right? And this has always been very difficult to, number one, think about how you commercialize it, and 2, how big the scale is. I think what you're starting to see now is some idea of scale, because it's based on all this gigawatt announcements have been made. But this brings up another interesting point is, do we have the grid system?
Well, this is my second question. So you can have, so maybe I'm wrong on demand. There's actually a lot of demand and there's a lot of supply as well. But then the limiting factor is power, because you need an enormous amount of power to run these servers, right?
Well, I think that is a fair question. I think that question will definitely become a more relevant one probably in the next 12 months, because 12 months from now is when a lot of these sovereign projects really kick off. But I think the thing is, the one thing that's interesting, though, is that you have a lot of guys who are in crypto mining are now looking at converting some of that power, which they take a lot of power, into driving some of the data centers.
Frank, maybe a last question for you. Now, Herald talked about some of the risks, which is energy constraints, for example. Another risk must be the speed with which technology evolves. And if you think about the dot-com boom, some of the companies that were, hot back then weren't around a few years later. Is there a risk? I mean, we think of companies like NVIDIA being a complete leader, but doesn't the technology evolve? Could we talk in 2 or 3 years about another chip company that suddenly has much better technology? Or is this different? Is it so hard to catch, essentially, the know-how, catch up with this know-how? How dynamic is this market ultimately when it comes to the top-end chips?
I think if you look at, and another way to think about this perspective is, this decade is very clearly about AI data infrastructure build. So I think it feels as though like this will continue probably until the end of the decade. The question is, beyond that, what happens, right? Is that really becomes the time for robotics to come in? Because you need like a certain maturity on the AI level before you can really implement the AI and the robotics together, right? So that could be something, the next big thing is into the next decade.
Now, I want to wrap it up a little bit here. So Jing is quite optimistic that some turnaround is taking place in the Chinese economy, and that the consumer actually could well be leading this instead of investment. So there's a change there. In the EVs, we see significant changes as well, going towards autonomous driving, battery technology is at the forefront of that as well, which, funny enough, might actually be at the forefront of AI as well, because demand is substantial, supply is substantial, but one of the limitations is, can we actually manage that and empower these things? And therefore, the Chinese might, to a certain extent, play a role in that particular field in AI as well. Fred?
I think you said it beautifully. I think despite all the uncertainty, I think to me in this world with tariffs, geopolitical risk, this conversation was actually a lot about optimism about the future.
Yeah,
and even if you only buy half of Frank's story about the potency of AI, that's still very bullish. Even if you buy half the story about electric vehicles, that's very bullish.
Yeah.
And even if half of China starts to consume, well, that's still very bullish
still
as well.
very
So
good
maybe
story.
it's a good time here to wrap up. We want to thank our panelists for joining us here under the Banyan Tree Live, Jing, Frank, and Yuqian. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining us at HSBC Global Viewpoint. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes.